Welcome to Assumptions. This is the podcast where two friends, one an atheist, that's me, Kyle, and one a Christian,
that's me, Daniel,
sit down and try and discover each other's worldviews.
Discover
Yes. Or understand each other's worldviews.
Speaking of discovering and understanding, on our last episode, we have been recapping our second season on sexuality and relationships, love in our times. And we just have been going through the episodes and just thinking about, we recorded these months ago, how we changed since then, what has struck our interest in listening to the original conversations. This is really just a chance for us to rethink and re-talk through the themes we've been talking about so far.
I like calling it like lining up the dots a little bit.
Yeah.
Right? Like connecting those dots as we look back on the season that we just concluded.
It's been a great conversation so far.
It has been. We recorded for like an hour and a half, and we decided to split this up into two parts. So part one was last time you heard us. This is now going to go right into our part two conversation. So we're just going to pick up exactly where we left off.
If you haven't listened to the episodes we're talking about, that's okay. I think this discussion is going to be interesting regardless. If you have listened, you'll get more out of it.
I mean, if you just want to have a fun time, just download all our podcasts and put it on shuffle and see whatever happens at that point.
I fall down to my knees. Eyes are raised to the sky.
Wesley.
Our next episode was with Wesley.
Yeah.
What did you want to pull out from Wesley?
Any thoughts that you had on it before I dive in?
You know, not really, to be perfectly frank. I'm trying to flip my head back to
I
that
took
interview.
notes this time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I forgot to bring my notes, so that was my failing. I love talking with Wesley.
Yeah,
I think that was a really great conversation to really understand his philosophy and why he chooses to be a gay man, but still within his church community.
Yeah.
And it feels like, as an outsider, that if I was inclined to go to church, that I would be like, why would I continue to go to a place that would reject me and not want me to be there in the first place? And he made, I think, a good argument for being the right churches, or the church's outlook should be to welcome those people in, yet at the same time advise them to follow Christ in the best possible path. Yeah. I still think that in and of itself is wrong, personally, but I thought that his explanation made a lot of sense.
Yeah. I think that he had a phrase in there at one point, life-giving limitations. I just thought it was an interesting way of thinking about those kind of limitations that are hard, but they do give life. And I think that's true of a lot of things in life. What you eat, how you work out, they're limitations, but they do end up thriving in those limitations. You talked about that tension between, do you prohibit, within a church or advise against certain acts, but then also welcome certain people in, like what that tension. Wesley's was part of a conference for LGBTQ plus Christians who are within the confines of historical Christian creeds about sexuality. So people that aren't embracing the lifestyle of homosexuality, but are identifying as gay. And there's been so much pushback from both sides. It's called Revoice, this conference, from people that are mad because they're being so bigoted and so limiting, and then people that are mad on the right that are saying you can't identify as gay and be a Christian. That's and so I'm not going to talk about those themes of this conference, but there's a lot of writing, a lot of ink spilled on both sides, and if Wesley's done a lot of writing on it as well. But I just think there's a real place for that sense of community. And one of the things that struck me about that interview, Annie and I listened to that interview together when we were editing. This was in May, and I was in Portland. Sat on her back porch.
It's been 7 months of us going through this season.
A lot of work, yeah. But we were sitting on her back porch and we listened to this interview, and then we had about a week hanging out together. And it haunted us, that interview, because as a young couple having our own life, we just were made really cognizant of wanting to include the broader community in our relationship. And Wesley is very deliberate in seeking community that's not just biological, not just family. And then we talked more about that later on in the season. But that just has been something that has been a challenge to me. Like, how can I do that? As a couple, how can we find ways to include those who are on the margins of family and bring them into the spiritual family that we have?
That's cool.
Yeah.
Our next interview was with Beth Smith, who I think we should bring on as our permanent co-host.
She was great.
She was really great. I really had a lot of fun talking with her. Again, her coming from the Christian perspective of dating, but I thought that she appropriately criticized how the church
Yeah.
handles certain relationships
Yeah.
and women and how that all fits together. Yet she's still, wanting to be part of that Christian faith.
Yeah, that was, and she also swore.
She also did swear. I think she was the first person to swear
Yes,
on
she
our
was.
show.
Yeah. Yeah, and just how she talked about the cult of marriage. Well, I think it was Wesley's phrase, the cult of romance, the cult of marriage in the church versus the New Testament attitude of community, which was countercultural. And Barry actually talked about this a little bit in the sense that that idea of valuing family life so much is fairly new within church history the last couple hundred years. And I just hearing Joy Beth's pain and how hard it was to be someone who's single and a mature adult within the church, just like that shouldn't be the case. And I think one of the themes, the sub-themes of this season has been highlighting that and how that theologically that shouldn't be the case, and yet it is. And I was listening to that episode for the edits and the show notes on the way back from a church wedding. And it was fun, but I definitely had that sense of it would be very hard to be single or divorced or gay and go to that wedding, because it was celebrating the marriage so much within the Christian theology, and just you're kind of leaving out some of the story. Yeah, marriage is important for church community, but it's not the ultimate. It's not the penultimate thing. It's yeah.
Right.
And it was the other thing that I was thinking about when I was recording or editing that episode was when Annie and I were second, because we date long distance, we only have shorter periods around each other, and it was our second trip. And I had reached out to a friend that I had met at a conference in Portland. He was a pastor at a great church in Portland called Door of Hope. And we had just become friends at this conference. And I just reached out to him and said, hey, I'm in town and I'm hanging out with Annie. We'd love to come say hi. And he and his wife, they have about 3 kids. They invited us over for dinner Sunday night. And I didn't know him that well, and he'd never met him. And there was another couple from their church without kids, newly married couple. And then there was a woman that was auditioning for a job at the church that flew out. So not a member of the community, a Christian. So it was all of us around this table, and they just pulled out all the stops on this meal. And we spent hours talking about these themes, what it is to be deliberate in community. And it was just such a poignant example of the community that can exist beyond just families.
Yeah.
And they opened their family's door on a Sunday evening after an exhausting day of church, which is hard for a pastor. And they welcomed us in, and it was this little taste of community. And some of those people I'll never see again.
I mean, I think it keeps going back to this idea that I constantly bring up, but the TV shows and the media that I love the most is when a bunch of different people have to form a community themselves, or like form a family themselves, who may not have necessarily chosen this group of people to be part of, but they're forced to.
Yeah.
A lot of Joss Whedon shows kind of do this.
Fellowship of the Ring.
Fellowship of the Ring, or Star Wars, or Star Trek. All of them are doing the same thing, where like we have to form this kind of central family ideal, this community ideal, and we're kind of all married in quotes to each other because of what we have to deal with. I don't know. There's something special about that when I watch things like that. I think, though, that we all agree with our episode 6 title, which is Don't Get Married. And that's all we have to talk about for that episode.
In the episode there, you did ask about sex in heaven.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to answer that because I think Barry touched on it.
Does talk about
but
that
I
a little
will link in the show notes to an article that talks about how when a marriage is at the end of its life, in terms of the couple's getting old, not that the marriage is about to dissolve. I phrased that wrong. When a couple is done with all the productivity and child raising, and how is that a taste of what heaven looks like? Great article. I'll link to it in the show notes.
It's called Heaven After Dark. Episodes 7 and 8 were a 2-parter. It was called We Are All Alone, parts 1 and 2. And I think you had these questions or concerns about living off of an identity.
Well, I want to that was a great episode.
It was, yeah.
I love the discussion.
Go back and listen to those episodes. I love that
discussion, yeah. Any thoughts you had on it just before we dive into?
Well, I think it's probably going to dovetail very nicely with what you're about to bring up, which is I thought a lot about my argument inside of those episodes. At least I'm pretty sure it was these episodes about why having identities are important. And I still believe that. I still believe different identities are important to have. But I've really thought about it a lot more and more about how identities can also be destructive. in kind of the same way that I think that they can be helpful. And I bring that up when this is actually another topic that I'm very interested in, which is fandoms. And how fandoms can actually become very toxic, especially
I was
on
totally
the internet.
expecting like you to throw down a topic that was going to be our next season.
Oh,
and
no,
I'm like,
no.
nope.
No, it won't be that. At least I don't think so. But you see this a lot where a thing happens or a thing is created.
Sure, Star
And-
Wars.
Yeah, actually, it's like the best example for it. Whatever, it could even be a new property. But let's say Star Wars is created.
Yeah.
There's a fan base that becomes part of that.
Yeah.
And they get really passionate about it. And they love Star Wars.
Yeah.
And they like talking about Star Wars.
Yeah.
And they're like maybe dressing up as their favorite character from Star Wars. And they like to read the novels and the behind the scenes. And they just love it. And then maybe something else is created inside of that community, like maybe another movie or another book or whatever it happens to be. And maybe you don't love it as much as that first one.
Sure.
But
The Last
there
Jedi.
are fans that like that thing.
Right.
Well, now you can tell those people, well, actually, you're not a real fan. Because a
Because
real
you
fan would actually like
Would
it
not
this way.
like it. Right.
And then you start to get like the trolls in the community that want to
Remake The
shout
Last
down
Jedi.
or remake
Yeah.
it, or say that it's wrong to actually hire these certain actors, or you've ruined my childhood because you've chosen to go a certain direction in this fictional property.
Yeah.
And I bring that all up, that when you identify so strongly with something like that, and that is how you present yourself in the world, like, I am a Star Wars fan, and that's your first way that you kind of think about yourself, then of course, when something is changed or different or altered, you take that as almost like a personal attack at that point, and you kind of lose semblance of your humanity in the process. And then these fandoms become super toxic to outsiders, and why a lot of people will then start to say things like, hey, I love this thing, but I hate its fans, which I felt a lot for certain things that I love. It's like, I love this thing so much, I'm not going anywhere near the super fans of that property because I just don't want to have a 2-hour argument with them. And I think that's what I want to bring out about identity, is that if that's the only way that you're presenting yourself, like, this is my identity and this is how I see myself, and that's the only way that you see yourself is this one thing, then that can be actually damaging in the long run.
Yeah, and I think it probably comes from Tim Keller, who I quote a lot because I love his stuff. But he talks about how
Oh gosh, here's another Tim Keller quote.
But he
Look for it in the show notes.
he talks about how if you build something off an identity, when that, let's say for example, you build off your career's identity, if that career falls apart, then you fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
If you build your bank account, I've had this happen in your bank account, and you realize it's getting low. Now you can't sleep because that's your
Right.
identity. And the example I love is your body. Like, if I love going to the gym, and when I get sick and I start losing my muscle, like, that's hard.
Yeah.
And but I was thinking about it too, in the sense that, so Tim Keller would then say, well, make your identity in Christ, because that's not dependent on you. But then you have people who for crises of faith and for their conscience's sake, for good reasons, end up leaving the faith. And then that's got to hurt even more, because if that can become an identity, and maybe that's a good thing if that's true. But I have a lot of pain.
I mean, this is also, I don't know if you actually went and listened to the podcast that I sent to you.
Yes,
there's
I
a
did.
podcast called Startup,
Startup,
which
yes.
actually started
I
off
just finished it.
very meta, which was, it was a podcast about a podcast network starting, which was the network that was making that podcast.
Yeah.
That's what it started off with. It's
Yeah.
recently in the last few years just profiled different entrepreneurs
Yeah.
and followed their stories
And
along.
there was an American Life. This American Life actually used part of it. For
Yeah,
one
it
of their
did. Actually, it
episodes.
did. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and Tim Keller was quoted on it.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all working together.
This all
But
fits.
it was talk about church planting
Yes.
in this last kind of mini season
Yeah.
that it had.
Yeah.
And one of the statistics that it brought out, which
Yeah.
I thought was really fascinating, is that Christianity as a whole has actually been losing membership over the last few years, year over year.
In North America, worldwide,
right.
it's blowing up.
Okay.
In
Well, in North America,
China.
at least, it is been losing membership
Yeah.
year over year, except in the evangelical churches.
That's right.
Because what did those churches give?
Yeah.
Answers.
Yeah.
It's like, no,
Yeah.
this is how you have to act, and this is how you get into heaven, and this is how you need
this
to
is
live
truth.
your life.
I think
and
it's
this is absolute
this is truth. Yeah.
Whereas all the other churches are like, we don't
Yeah.
really know. Like this, like we put our faith, and that's how we want to live our lives, and like
Yeah.
be kind to your fellow man, that sort of thing. But it's like we don't have answers here, and people don't want that in these times of uncertainty. I don't think.
Yeah.
And why I bring that up is that I think that's why you see such this division going on. We have people that are getting pulled right to the far right and to the far left.
Mm-hmm.
There's like no middle ground between these people because like I identify as a Christian, which means that I can't like you.
Right.
And then the other opposite is like you're a Christian, which means you hate me, so I can't listen to what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I think both are damaging in different ways. But if you have a chance, I definitely recommend going and listening to that church planting miniseries.
Yeah,
I thought it was
we'll link it in the show
fascinating.
notes.
to
It
go
was
and listen to.
it's a whole other discussion from that because I felt that a lot of that, I guess a lot of it I identified with. I'm like, yeah, that's my world. And a lot of it was like, that is not my world. Like a church camp boot camp, like the reality like show contestants. I was just like, this is not church. This is corporate. Like it just there's just a lot of it felt very evangelical to me, which like way more evangelical than I am. Cultural evangelicalism. Part of
I'm
like,
evangelical, but that's too evangelical for me.
Basically, yeah. It's funny though because we talked a lot about the sense of community on those episodes and the community that you get. I actually just recently, this is maybe come as a shock to you, Kyle. I haven't told you this yet, but
You're gay. No.
but I switched churches recently.
did?
I did. I'm going to a different church now.
Whoa.
Which is a whole other discussion.
Big news. We'll have to talk about that maybe off mic.
Yeah. But I bring this up not to, cause a flurry but because when I went to this new church for the first time, it's the first time in a new church, never met these people before. It felt like home. Like it was this real sense like, this is home. And this is, And so that sense of community is not just based on the people that I know, but maybe they can analyze the psychology, the heck out of that if you want.
Yeah.
But I just was like, no, this is a family that transcends just culture and transcends just people.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right. So then we went into the last 4 interviews that we did.
That's right.
The first one was a combination one,
Yeah.
which was Nick Taniguchi and Tyler May.
Yeah.
And 2 very different people, but 2 friends.
That's right.
Which I think is
really
great. That I'm cultivating this community myself of
It
people.
would have been fun if they were like in the same, if it was a threesome interview, like with all 3 of you guys.
Interestingly enough, when I interviewed Nick, Tyler was in the room.
I know, but it's been fun to hear those comments. I wish I was there for that interview. I think that's when we learned.
Yeah.
Such a listening. I'm like, oh, we need to do interviews together
Because
I had a whole bunch of questions that for both Tyler and Nick, and I did agree with Tyler much more than I agree with Nick. Yeah,
we can all agree Nick is the worst. But
any thoughts on that?
I love you, Nick.
Yeah, he's fun.
Any thoughts on it?
Yeah.
I'm probably too close to both interview subjects to really be objective about it. I think, and I said this, I believe, in the intro to that episode, I think Nick is one of the best people I've ever met in my entire life. Him and his brother are so warm and open and kind.
You could feel that.
And I think it's important to know that, you don't necessarily have to be part of a religion to have those kind of attributes part of you. I think
there are nice people out there.
There are nice people out there.
Christians.
I guess the only thing that I would pull out from there specifically is this idea around polyamory, and I'm not a person that can really speak much to that.
It's a little hard to critique the interview episodes because we turned off the mic and now we're gonna stab you in the back.
Right.
This interview, you should have said this, and he's wrong about this. Yeah, it's a little.
No, absolutely not. I kind of agree with you. We were talking before we started recording here, so I have this written down in my notes about. Do you think that polyamory diminishes true love?
Yeah. What I meant by that is the sense that I'm not married, but in a relationship, one of the strengths of it is you expose yourself to this person with everything you have, your emotions, your worst days, your best days, your body, right? You're exposed.
Yeah. And
this person still loves you. And that there's a mutual trust that's being built up because of that commitment and because of that exclusivity. Like this, it protects that love. And so then the love can flourish because you're safe. And how in a polyamorous relationship, does that diminish love because it's just being thrown around everywhere?
Yeah, I don't know if it would or not. And again, I am not an expert by any means on polyamory, but I feel that this goes again back to community and your argument already about how marriage is not necessarily the ultimate goal that you're leading towards. That marriage is not the be all and end all.
But for sex, it is. Like that's the distinction, right? It's like, we're letting other people in, but to that relationship, which is good, but the sex act is for a couple, and that strengthens that couple's love and commitment to each other because they expose each other and join each other to each other in a way that's very rare. And if that's thrown around, part of it's the same argument for even if you're not polyamorous, if you live essentially polyamorous by sleeping around, Like, yeah, I think that's another.
That's where you're coming from.
Yeah, it's kind of like, well, that,
Yeah, I guess I don't know.
polyamorous is unique because it's actually open. Like, yeah, we're going to
For
do this.
me, I think that it is possible. I think it is possible to love multiple people. And I think this is even shown by people who may have had a spouse like pass away and they've decided to like marry again.
Sure.
Or to divorce because it was the end of a relationship that was not good and then going into another relationship. I don't see that as being all that different. It's just that in that case, they did it sequentially rather than at the same time.
Right.
So I think it's possible to have that love and that deep connection with a group of people.
Right.
But I think maybe this is one of those things we should invite Nick back and maybe he can kind of delve into that a little
Yeah,
bit
because
more.
I would say that, you need to love more people than just one. That's why having a community that's not just your family is so important. But don't sleep around with them all. I wondered, though, like if Nick came back, I'd love to ask, dive into more. He said he was nihilistic. That's his worldview.
Yeah, which actually surprises me when he said that.
But I'm just fascinated with the connection between the two. Polyamory and nihilism. I just love to explore that more. I'm just going to leave that there. But he said something interesting about VidCon.
Well, actually, I remember this more clearly now. He said he was more of an absurdist than he was a nihilist. Did he not?
Right. Sure. Yeah, I don't remember. Yeah.
I think that's what he actually says.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. But just that connection would be interesting to explore. He talked about VidCon, and he talked about, and it was interesting hearing your experiences, Kyle, about VidCon as being this place of community and his being the same, and the sense of, he actually said the phrase, I want it to happen all the time. I wish it could happen all the time. And I was reminded of friends. I have a lot of friends that go to Shambhala, which is a big EDM music festival in BC. And I
think it's just an excuse not to shower for 4 days. But
I have some really good friends and relatives that just love it there. And they have formed such a community. And it's this little pocket of deep community that only happens. And it just reminded me of a very similar experience in the sense of, if it can't happen all the time, if it's just this pocket, like those camp experiences, they're great, they're fine. But like, is that really true community? Like, I want a community that's sustainable into the daily rhythms of my life.
I guess. I mean, I think you're talking about two different things. I think there's different communities that you can be a part of, and some that you are in all the time, and some that you are only there part of the time. And I don't think that there's anything wrong or better or worse necessarily between either ones. I think that there's a few different reasons that are in play here. Number one, I think this is the very reason why people always think of their childhood as like the good old days is because you didn't have to worry about anything. You weren't paying bills. You didn't have a job that you had to go to. The worst thing you had to do is like, I have to do homework, or like, does that girl think I'm handsome? Like, that was basically all you had to worry about on your day-to-day life. And when you then come into your adulthood, being able to be brought back to a place like, I don't have to worry. I'm around people that I like. They seem to be supportive of me.
Yeah.
And we don't have these responsibilities outside of ourselves. So that encapsulation of that weekend, yes, obviously you get to go back and be like, I basically get to go to a time again where I don't have to worry about anything.
I guess what I'm saying
it's seductive in that kind of way.
But I guess what I'm saying then is, if that is the only place that you find community, then there's something's not quite right. Because community should work in those broken times, the times of stress, the times of, and if those hard times are really when the community becomes wonderful, right? Like if you have friends that stick through you and you can call up when you're lonely and sad and frustrated, like that's not near as fun as a weekend at VidCon or Shambhala, but isn't that more accurate? And isn't that kind of community ultimately? I don't know. I'm not critiquing these festivals. I'm just saying, if that's your only sense of community that comes from that once a year, and that's your defining own a community, that's not real life.
I agree with
argument, right?
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
That it's not real life.
Yeah.
But what that does provide you is hopefully those relationships that can move outside of just that weekend, where you can call them up and you can have those deeper conversations with. It's just that weekend. That weekend is basically just when everyone gets to come together again for a little bit of time before they all break away again.
And I know people that met at Shambhala and then had a long relationship. And
right. So it's possible to happen there.
I love Tyler's conversation. I loved his description of his understanding of bisexuality and homosexuality. He's like, there's a lot of sin out there. So it's like, it's just one amongst many. Like, he just has this really forthright way of doing that. And then the other thing I loved is he talked about how friendships have to be selfless.
Yeah. And
I thought that was really true. Like, you shouldn't be looking for friendships because yourself. Like, you need to.
Right. Yeah. You have to. It is a give and take, right?
He said it's a total give. Like, you give in order to get.
Yeah.
It's not give and take. It's not an equation here. It's just like, no. it takes work, and I'm gonna give myself. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's great. Yeah. He talked about you asked him to distill what his Christian faith meant to him, and he said thankfulness. I think which is true, but I would ask him to articulate that more and be like, what are you thankful for? And Tim Keller again, good old Tim Keller, but he has this quote, which is it's a simplistic, it's not the whole thing, but he says, Christianity is recognizing that you are more deeply flawed than you will ever know, and yet you are more deeply loved than you will ever know. And that produces thankfulness.
Hi everyone, it's Kyle, completely out of character and breaking into the conversation to let you know a few things. As always, Assumptions is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB. If you haven't gone to the Alberta Podcast Network's website, there are so many great shows to listen to. Shows like A Branded World, Frank Reactions, Speaking Municipally, or maybe you could listen to one of the newest shows on the network, Putting It Together. Yes, this is a new show that I'm doing, that I already mentioned in this podcast. Or I'm about to. It's late, and I can't remember, but this is for Broadway fans in general, and Stephen Sondheim fans in particular, where I cover his entire body of work, show by show, and song by song. I think it turned out really, really well. We're also sponsored by another podcast this week. Back to School Again is a podcast about people who made the decision in midlife to return to school, either to pursue a new type of career, to augment their current career, or just for the sheer challenge of learning something new. It chronicles the personal journey of host Katrina Ingram, who is back in school after more than 2 decades away. It features conversations with a wide range of midlife learners who are currently enrolled in post-secondary studies or have recently completed a post-secondary degree. The podcast shares their stories, what brought them to this moment, how they balance the responsibilities of school, work, and family, and where they hope their educational pursuits will take them. The podcast is available now in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and most other podcatchers. You can also find the episodes and the show notes at backtoschoolagain.ca. Back to School Again is presented by Norquest College and is an affiliated member of the Alberta Podcast Network. Find it and our other affiliates at albertapodcastnetwork.com. Thanks everyone for listening. I think these wrap-up episodes turned out really good. But for now, let's get back to our regularly scheduled program. Sorry, before I forget, I said that there was 2 things I wanted to bring up about the VidCon thing, and I also brought this up already on the podcast, but that reminds me of my favorite composer that I like to bring up a whole lot, which is Stephen Sondheim.
Yeah, you have a podcast about him, don't you?
I'm coming up very, very soon,
Okay.
yes. It is this idea about moments. This is from Into the Woods, the show Into the Woods.
Which we also quoted before. Tim Keller and Into the Woods.
I know, all the time. Welcome to our Tim Keller Into the Woods podcast.
Yeah.
It's really niche content. But the idea behind that song that I'm referencing is the fact that without moments, that they wouldn't mean as much, right? Like if every day you had a moment, like if you were living in that moment every single day, then that would be real life. That is your everyday life. Those moments mean so much because they are a moment in time, and then you take from that what you need to like go through the rest of your life.
So you're saying VidCon is a moment.
Yeah, it's a moment. It's a moment in the woods, because without those moments, we would never know we had one, right? We need to have those like special times in our life. Like, man, that was a cool thing that just happened.
Yeah.
But it only happened that one time, and that's why it's important.
Right. And I'm saying that that's important, but you should also find those moments in the day-to-day life.
Mr. Buzzkill over here. Okay, Lish was
Yeah,
our next
that was
interview.
fun. I enjoyed that. By the
Yeah,
way,
it was
it
really,
only has
really-
one play on SoundCloud. So if you haven't listened to it,
There's more plays overall that she has, like much
Yeah.
more, but yes, on SoundCloud it's the one.
Anyway,
I
it
think
was
it's
a
the
great
last name
conversation.
that throws people off. It's
She's
like,
like,
no,
oh, I'm not listening to this.
can't do that.
It was a great conversation, though. Any thoughts on that one? I have a few.
I mean, the only big one I think to pull out from there is the fact that I think she mentioned something along the lines of putting her faith into the universe.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
And I think you and I might be aligned a little bit in this, which is I consider the universe to be pretty like unforgiving and doesn't really care much about me as a person.
She had this she said that she trusts everything will work out. She trusts
Right,
that the
yeah.
universe will work things out. And I mean, I'm glad she's trusting and like that
Yeah.
she has that calm and peace from that. But I guess my distinction is it's a different story if you trust the God who's actively involved in creating and sustaining the world and who cares about me and versus trusting the universe, and which doesn't always work out, because there are times of deep tragedy.
Mhm.
And there are times where it's just like, yeah, it's too big, too cosmic to push back on.
Sometimes there's just a comet that hits the earth, and it's
Exactly. It's like, and then just like, does the universe actually care for you? Like, what about the universe? How can you know the universe's character
Mhm.
and how it'll care for you?
How do you actually? I'll answer this question in a moment, but I guess
Yeah.
how do you square that with your religious faith? Let's use
Yeah.
that comet, right? It comes
Right.
and smashes into the earth
Sure.
tomorrow.
Yeah.
Is that God's will, or is that just the universe doing that, and God will support us after the fact? Like, how do you? Where do you come from? with that?
I'm not like a watchmaker belief. So the watchmaker, which is that God created the universe, wound it up like a clock,
Mhm.
and then just take care.
Yeah.
He's active and present in the world. And so, yeah, there's times when tragedy strikes, and there's a lot of writing on how to deal with that from a Christian perspective. But ultimately, I think that the Christian perspective, which is that God is actively involved in the world and he himself suffered in order to redeem us, means that tragedy is awful and it's really hard to deal with. But there's an ultimate sense of trust in the God who is behind the world, and that will make all things new and will wipe every tear from every eye. That's just, for me, is just a lot more, gives me a lot more confidence than just trusting that the universe will work things out.
Mhm.
Because
So sorry, what is your ultimate thing?
yeah,
So
that God
will
God is at
somehow
work.
support us through that.
Well, no, that God is at work through these things. So he's not just like, oh, oops, that shouldn't have happened.
Oh, so
But
he's the
like-
one who sent the comet.
Yeah,
Okay.
he's the one that's. I mean, but at the same time, the world has to run on its own. Like, the world is. He's not going to interfere with it. If you step in front of a street, the bus is still going to hit you because the world is still running,
Mhm.
but he is still actively involved in that world. But I did appreciate, though, how Lish talks about. I felt when I listened to that episode, I thought, she's not. There's this split in understanding the world that took place in the Enlightenment, where we can understand the world now, and so the world is as it is, a very scientific view, and her view, I feel like, pushed back against that. There's more going on here,
Mhm.
and I appreciate that. I think that's one of the reasons why I love talking to her, is that
Yeah,
we have a different worldview, but she also she understands there's more going on in the world than just a very mathematical explanation of things.
Right. Yeah, she's
Yeah.
able to pull a lot of different things out. I really loved our conversation we had.
Yeah.
Next was another conversation interview
Yeah.
that was only me.
Yeah.
I got to talk with Rabbi Seth Goldstein.
Yeah. Have you
And-
converted yet?
Yes, I'm sorry. No, I did not. And I joked about that, about how I felt that the Jewish faith, the way that he was describing it at least, felt a lot more welcoming to other people rather than any Christian faith that I had heard before. Now, I know that you have a little bit of criticisms on that specifically,
Uh-huh.
and as a non-religious scholar at all,
Yeah.
I don't think I was fully equipped to be able to push
Yeah, I
back
really
or ask
wish
any
I was
questions.
at that conversation, because I appreciate his time, and it was an interesting conversation. But I think when I was listening to it, and again, Annie was actually with me when we listened to that.
Yeah.
I think there's some interesting things that came out of it, but at one point we're just like, she turned to me, he's not saying much. He's talking a lot about his own beliefs. For me, he said a lot,
Mhm.
but what specifically makes what he's saying Jewish? It didn't sound explicitly Jewish. It just sounded very accepting and
Mhm.
it's like, yeah, like pretty mainstream, his
Right.
belief in a lot of ways, which is fine. But I kind of wanted to learn more about what does the Torah, the Jewish text, have to say about
Right.
all these topics that you asked them about, and then how do you interpret that now in the modern world? Because he
Well,
said that
well,
he fell on the liberal side of things, so he's not.
Yeah, he did. Yeah,
he did.
for
But
sure.
how do you reconcile that with all these commands in the Torah, which
Yeah.
are very explicit about these
Well,
things?
I guess what I loved a lot from him, and then I know you said that Christianity doesn't follow like a list, right? Like
Yeah.
we don't have a list of things that you necessarily have to do every single day. The part that I loved that he described about is the Jewish faith is all around asking questions. It's not just to sit there and be like, oh, well, God said this, so I'm just going to
Sure.
do this. I'm just going to follow this reason because people have told me so. It's more like, no, the entire faith is built around why. Just keep asking why and really delving it further and further and further and arguing your position about like, does this actually make sense? Does this actually fit our ideals? And I think I really like that a whole lot than just being like, sit there, just accept what we're telling you. No, we want you actually to be having this conversation constantly going back and forth.
It's interesting the tension of liberal Judaism. So you're not being strict on the doctrine, but what's left is the community. So you have a lot of people who are quite liberal in their beliefs and don't agree with their Jewish faith, but maintain that faith. So, for example, atheists. Like we have a mutual friend who is an atheist and is very involved with the Jewish community. It's fascinating. Like, how does that work? But I think that I have some friends who grew up Christian. When they married, it was a very Christian wedding. They were totally committed to their faith. The last 5 years, they no longer believe in faith.
Right.
And I asked, I mean, this may have changed, but I asked him, he's a PhD in biblical scholarship. And I asked him, how does this affect your church life? And he says, well, we want church for our kids because of that community. And he actually did the same thing about, like, it's like a Jewish person who no longer believes in God, but still wants to attend the synagogue.
Right.
That community. So it just is an interesting dynamic. I did think it was interesting, Seth's observation that of the long-term life in that community, that he's seen the deaths and the births and the marriages of those who grew up in the faith. And that's unique. I don't actually have that. Like, I've moved churches a number of times. Right. So like, I thought
that was such an interesting outlook. And I think that probably there's a lot of priests and other religious luminaries that have the same feeling, which is like, I have literally seen this family from the time like mother and father married to the kids, to their kids getting married, to the parents dying, like seeing that entire evolution. Like, that must be, well, very, very honorable. And you must feel very honored to be part of that journey, but also at the same time, very hard to see all those changes and stuff at the same time. Our very last interview was with Barry Danilik.
What did you think of that?
It was great. I had to be reminded exactly what we talked about. It was so long ago. And him bringing up the idea that it's okay to be lonely, I thought was... just
release that one, though? Didn't you just listen to the...
That's what I mean. It's like when I was re-listening to it as I was editing it, I was like, this is so long ago. I don't really even remember what we talked about in this episode. This idea that he's like, I love being lonely. Right? He says that at one point in the conversation. It's like people flee from this feeling, but there's nothing wrong with being lonely. It's all about your, I guess, mindset and the way that
he
you
said,
approach
like, loneliness is a choice, he said at one point. The sense that you can choose to dwell in loneliness, or you can choose ways of combating that. I love that interview. I thought it was a blast. And I had a heart. I think I was working out while I was listening to it. I just and I was going to stop and then shower and then pick it up. And I just sat there finishing it.
In your sweat.
This is so great. But and the other thing that I just found was interesting about that was his observation that the cult of marriage and then the Christian faith, not to say that marriage itself, but this emphasis on marriage as being the ultimate is relatively new historically. Like, that's a newer idea within Christianity. And that was our season.
Man. I would love to hear what other people's responses were to the whole season as a whole. Obviously, it's a bit too late to do feedback to be included in our next 1 or 2 episodes, but definitely you can leave us comments either on Twitter or our Facebook page, all that kind of stuff.
Send us an email too, or just reach out to us. We'd love to hear what you thought. We'd also love to hear kind of what you want. Other topics you want to do next. We haven't decided yet. I haven't really talked about our next season.
Right. So there's a lot of time.
Give us some ideas.
Not that we've discussed this, but I feel that we'll probably do something very similar to last time, where in January we might release some bonus episodes, and then our actual season will start sometime after that. We'll see what happens there.
It's going to be a busy year. But overall, as we've thought backwards now through the season, I think I've learned a lot through this. I've learned the kind of conversations I'm not good at. Like, I would much rather talk to Kyle about worldview and storytelling than about sexuality. And so like, it was humbling, I guess is what I'm saying. Like, these were harder conversations to have than I thought they were going to be.
Good conversations.
They were.
I think it was good to bring some of that information out.
And I think too, like, us spending a year thinking about this, listening to the episodes, recording them, doing research, I think it's changed me in a way. And I would say that it's made me much more cognizant of broader community in my life, and the need to not emphasize the cult of romance in the church. Like, that's just it just has brought that home in ways. So I've been shaped by these conversations.
I think it's what it's really doing for me, which is good for me because I've always had a hard time really eloquently distilling what my beliefs and stuff are. It's making it easier for me to be like, no, like these are the tenets of what I believe in and why I believe them in. Correct. The tenets of atheism. I think it's going to be a list of 9. But that sort of thing. And
6? Isn't it 6 sixes?
Yeah, 6 sixes. That's right. For me too, again, intellectually, I kind of knew this kind of going in, but reaffirm that even though there's a broad brush of what religion is, that everyone within that still has different opinions and ideas as well. It's not just like one thing that everyone believes in inside of Christianity.
Speaking of those different things, our next episode, we will hear from those of you who have sent in feedback and ideas and questions and just have a discussion around those. So stay tuned for that.
Stay tuned for that. This has been a very long episode as I'm looking at the clock. But if you do want to get in contact with us, here are some contact ways, which is Assumptions Pod. That is what we are on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook. So if you just do facebook.com/assumptionspod or twitter.com/assumptionspod, that is where you're going to find information about us. The website is assumptionspod.com. You can send in feedback to assumptionspod@gmail.com. My own best possible way to probably get in contact with me or follow me around the internet is at the Kyle Marshall. That's Marshall with 2 L's. What's the best way to follow you, Daniel?
You can find me on Twitter too, but my website's a good starting place, which is actually, if you just go to assumptionspod.com, it just redirects me to my website. But type me in the internet, it's Daniel Melvill Jones. You'll
good for that
me.
SEO. So until next time, I don't know how to wrap this up.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for
Let's
listening.
Just do that.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Assumptions is produced by Kyle Marshall and Daniel Melvill Jones. This episode edited by Kyle Marshall. Our thumbnail was created by the always great Chris Taniguchi. Most of the music in this episode is from the band the Parson Red Heads. You can check out their music anywhere digital music is available. If you want a full rundown of the articles and media that we reference, check out the show notes that Daniel puts together that are attached to this episode. It's always a stellar document he puts together. Thanks for listening to the credits. We'll be back to answer audience questions in a couple of weeks.